who studies two things. One is the legitimacy of executive action in immigration law. And some of the stuff she's going to present us today, I believe, is on the role of federal regulatory agencies in promoting the integration of immigrants and racial minorities in U.S. society. Prior to joining the academy, Ming was also worked for the Honorable James Browning of the U.S. Court of Appeals, Ninth Circuit in San Francisco, and has worked for many different organizations, including the NAACP, the Brookings Institution, the National Election Facilitation and Legal Consortium, among others. Will you join me in welcoming Ming? I'm sorry to jump on my own introduction, but I should say that Ming also directs the Immigration Law and Policy Program at the Colorado Immigrant Scholars Network, which we're extremely grateful for the it's being mostly sponsored by them. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you all for being here. Thank you, Fernando, for the invitation. I have not talked about this work in a little while. You've probably all been in this position where you've had your head buried in data and buried in ratings. So this is a really great time for me to need to come up from the trees to look at the forest. So thanks for giving me that chance. I also just wanted to say that I'm really happy to be speaking at IBS because this is the first book project that I've worked on. And the audience is a little different than I'm used to writing for in terms of writing law review articles, which can be very technical. Some would say even a little bit dry. And what I'm trying to go for with this book, which will eventually come out with the Stanford University Press, is ideally, it will be an academic book, but the idea is to try to reach a generalist audience with interdisciplinary interests. And as I understand it, that's exactly what IBS is. So I think this will be a really good audience for me to test out some of these ideas and to get your thoughts and feedback on how these ideas are communicating to you, how they are speaking to you, and also your pushback. Because where the book is at its current moment is that I am wrapping up the first draft of the full manuscript, at which point it will go out for final approval with the publishers. So there's still lots of room to change the text before it goes into production. So I really appreciate the feedback that you have. So let me start by introducing the bigger picture, the larger argument in the book, and then I'll try to use that to situate the particular chapter I want to present today, which is one of two sort of meaty empirical chapters. And again, that seemed like it might be a good fit for this audience. As a whole, the book, which is currently titled Constructing Citizenship for Non-Citizens, is about immigration in the United States. And in particular, what I try to do with the book is to focus on the slice of immigration that nobody is talking about right now, which is to say, I'm trying to focus on the process of immigrant integration that happens once immigrants have entered the United States and started to live here, whether on a formal pathway to citizenship or in some other form of more limited status or with no status. And so the premise of the book is that the policy and also the scholarly focus has been so heavily skewed toward immigration enforcement that we need to be thinking about these other issues in order to, at some point in the future, perhaps utopia of 100 years, I would imagine at least 2 years, that we can be thinking about a more whole picture of what immigration and citizenship can look like. So that's the big picture of what the book is trying to do. The argument in the book that's developing from a series of interviews. At this point, there are interviews with about 100 immigrants in 3 or 4 different kinds of legal statuses. And today I'll focus on 2 of those 4. But the argument that is developing across all of the groups is that in this enforcement-minded immigration climate, legal status is becoming a master status. It's becoming a key institutional pathway that produces citizenship inequality and inhibits integration in the United States. That might not seem as shocking for the chapter you're going to hear about today, but what I do think has been interesting to me in putting together the different categories of legal status is that I'm finding this story to be true even of legal permanent residents, green card holders, who for many years in the United States considered themselves even de facto citizens. Right? So that is the big story, and that is to some extent shared across all of the different legal groups that I'm looking at. Of course, there are important variations across those groups, and that's where I think the significance of this case study comes in. So let me quickly outline for you the structure of the book so that we can get situated with today's chapter. The book starts with two framing chapters. One to introduce this idea of semi-citizens, which is to say, on a spectrum from being undocumented in the United States to being a full US citizen, for the sake of the spectrum, I suppose naturalized citizen would be sort of the far end. Everybody who is short of a full US citizen is some form of semi-citizen. Right? And so that is to say that whether legal or illegal, to use the simplest frame, they fall short of full citizenship status and all of the rights and benefits and social memberships that entails. So in the first chapter of the book, I try to lay out this rather expansive definition of semi-citizenship in order to help, probably most of all, lawyers and law professors think beyond the kind of law school definition of citizenship that might be more familiar in their mind. In the second chapter, which I think is probably the best setup for today's discussion, I talk about the different pathways to citizenship that exist in US law. And so by that, I certainly do mean the pathways that concern the process of entering the country, let's say on a temporary visa, getting a green card, and then eventually being able to naturalize. But I also mean the pathways to substantive forms of citizenship, such as economic belonging, or social belonging, and political belonging in the United States. And that is a more informal process that has traditionally been decentralized within the United States. It's not only been decentralized, but it's also been left to more voluntary mechanisms, the efforts of state and local governments, nonprofit organizations like churches and unions, and otherwise generally outside the realm of what the federal government has considered its institutional obligation to newcomers in the United States. The third chapter is about pathways to citizenship for legal immigrants. And so this chapter has interviews with, I think at this point, about 60 green card holders of various types. So those include those who come through the traditional pathways of either family-sponsored or employment-based immigration, refugees, and those who obtain citizenship through the military. So in some ways, this is the major case in the book. And the one that I'm presenting to you is the oddball case that falls outside of it, which is to say, as compared to those who have a pathway to citizenship, how do we think about this idea of integration for those who don't have a pathway? That certainly includes those who are in some form of undocumented status. I'm going to focus on DACA students today, who have kind of this liminal in-between twilight status, right? Who they're all formally undocumented, but do have a quite limited legal protection that, as you might know, has become more limited by the day with the efforts to roll back that status. And the other major category of non-citizens with a blocked pathway that I'll focus on are a collection of international students, international scholars, high-tech workers who are on H-1B visas. So collectively, those who are temporary visa holders. And I'll just say one semi-autobiographical note about why this chapter is in the book. And so this has always been the hard chapter for me. This chapter was actually not in my original book proposal because I thought if I was going to tell a story about pathways to citizenship, I would focus on those who actually have such a pathway. And then the external reviewers for the proposal had said, both because of their theoretical interest and because of the policy interest, they really wanted to hear about undocumented immigrants. And so, because I do believe there is a theoretical tie-in, I felt like it was worthwhile to take that on board, which at that point meant conducting 50 more interviews as well as writing a new chapter. I think if it had only been policy interest, I might have hesitated a little more. I mean, I can see why that would be useful. But what I wanted to do and what I want to do today is to make sure that that chapter in this particular study does in fact advance the broader aims that I've been trying to sketch for you. And then I end with some policy prescriptions. So I'm taking a little more time than I meant on background. So let me move through this a little bit more quickly, although if you do have questions about this, I'm happy to return to any of these ideas that are coming from the earlier framing chapters before the actual study. So in chapter 2 of the book, I will have, at this point, hopefully established this distinction between formal citizenship and substantive citizenship that I just laid out for you. Right, with formal citizenship consisting primarily of the legal status, and then substantive citizenship having the social, political, economic, and legal dimensions. And those draw somewhat on the work of T.H. Marshall in the work Social Citizenship, also Linda Bosniak, some other citizenship theorists who have talked about citizenship as being a broader conception, again, than what a law school definition of immigration and citizenship might require. The claim that I'm overall making in the book is that you need to have both components in order to have this sort of perforated, unrealized state of full citizenship that includes substantive and formal. And it is a somewhat controversial claim against the literature because I think there's a pushback against this idea that formal citizenship is as important as I ultimately believe that it is. And I think that comes both from a movement to think beyond the US government and the federal government as being the sole disseminator of citizenship status in a world of global migration and other forms of transnational citizenship. I also think that that push comes from below in the reality that within the context of the US, increasingly what we see is states and localities that are stepping up to create a form of belonging that might fall short of full federal citizenship and yet provide important means of integrating. So, as one perhaps familiar example, for DACA students who lack the formal legal status, there's often a claim in the literature to very high levels of social belonging because DACA students, sort of the rallying cry is that we are Americans, right? We have lived the bulk of our life in the United States. In some cases, really don't have any memory or meaningful experience outside the United States. And so socially, and then increasingly politically, and with the benefit of DACA economically, are able to become all but Americans. So that, I think, has become the dominant story, and the one that I'm developing pushes back against that a bit, not to say that substantive citizenship doesn't matter, but to say that formal citizenship still matters, again, especially in this enforcement-minded climate. Okay, this is a little bit small for you, but it's, I think, at least important for me to highlight a few points about the two groups that I'm focusing on today. These are the pathways to citizenship, and I actually want to redraw this a bit, but what you'll notice is the conventional pathway, the one that I'm focusing on in my main case study, is that one enters the United States. This is presumably on a legal visa, and then becomes a legal permanent resident or a green card holder after meeting a number of requirements. And then over time, usually 5 continuous years of residency, that person can become a naturalized citizen. The pathways that I'm focusing on today are these broken and perforated pathways, which is to say for a temporary visa holder, such as an H-1B high-skilled worker, or an F-1 student, international student, they would enter the United States, again, in a legal status, although a temporary one, and would not have a clear pathway to becoming a green card holder or a naturalized citizen. The H-1B would have the closest, right? There's the possibility of that through a series of extensions, renewals, and then eventually adjustment of status, either through a family-sponsored visa at that point, or through an employer-based sponsor. However, it's not an automatic process, and the government doesn't provide any support to help make that happen. For an F1 visa, the pathway is even a bit more broken. Right? The F1 visa who is first arriving in the United States not only doesn't have a guaranteed path to citizenship, but actually has to say they're not coming to the United States with the intention of settling. Right? That they are coming for the temporary purpose of completing a series of studies. Now, the reality is many F1 visa holders do become H-1B visa holders, which is to say high-tech workers, and then become eligible to become citizens. So I'm not saying it is a completely blocked pathway, but it is a burdened pathway. It has become ever more burdened with policy changes that have made it harder to make those adjustments. This pathway is the most broken. Entering the United States, becoming, the language here is again a legal resident. This is a borrowed diagram. But entering the United States without documentation. I would mention you could enter with a temporary visa, overstay the visa, and then end up in this category as well. And then for moving here, you'll notice there is no solid pathway to becoming a temporary visa holder or a green card holder, and then going on to naturalized citizenship. And if anything, the immigration laws of the last 20 years have assured that this pathway is ever more broken. So that, for example, those who are in undocumented status or unauthorized status because their visa overstays might have an ability to adjust status. For example, if they obtain citizenship through an immediate family member, such as a spouse or a parent. But for those who enter without documents at all, it's become nearly impossible to make that transition. So that's the block pathway that I'm talking about. All right, so now we're finally at the main chapter. The chapter that I'm presenting, as I've already alluded, focuses on the block pathways to citizenship. And in particular, what that tells us about the broader question of how the United States does, or in this case primarily does not, provide a pathway toward integrating in both the formal and the substantive sense. The empirical study focuses on the two groups I've mentioned, and primarily I have looked at existing quantitative data about the integration trajectories of each of these groups. But my original contribution is the interviews that I conducted with these immigrants about their experience existing without the full pathway to citizenship. So this is obviously not the full interview questionnaire, but the questions were of the spirit: how do immigrants with block pathways navigate their semi-citizenship, knowing that it can't lead to that full path? And I have about 20 interviews, so this is not a major end study, but this is kind of a smaller end study with in-depth interviews ranging from 45 minutes to an hour and a half with each individual. 20 or so are in that temporary visa holder, that temporary visa category, again, a mix of students and workers at the university and outside the university, but primarily in the high-tech industry, if outside the university. And then undocumented immigrants. And this is, by focusing on DACA recipients, I am focusing on a subset, but it is a subset that I think is in some ways the most sensible group to focus on if you're going to talk about pathways to citizenship, because it's the group that has the greatest prospect, even though the pathway is not there yet. And then in this audience, I can admit, it's the group that's the easiest to get approval from the university for from institutional review board, because they're the group that is legally most protected, although still somewhat vulnerable to study. Okay, so again, these are the kinds of questions that I focused on with the international students and scholars. I think what I'll do now is take you through the major findings in each of those categories. For the international students and scholars, the interviews focused on questions about the initial migration experience, but then in particular experiences once inside the United States. And again, the questions were developed to speak to social, economic, political, and legal integration. So just as a sample, some of the questions were things like, to what extent do you identify with the United States versus your home country? How do you feel States or upon completion of the term of their visa. And then finally, questions about the policy climate that we're in. So what is your perception of the role of federal government, and I think it was actually a bit broader than federal government, but of the government in providing institutional support. So those are the key questions I focused on. And again, if there is a dominant story that comes out of the relatively small literature on international students and scholars, I think it is that temporary visitors of the type that I'm focusing on are relatively privileged guest workers who don't require any institutional support in order to integrate. And I think primarily that argument comes from a focus on economic integration. And just a recognition that many international students and international scholars and H-1B holders have already arrived at a level of economic security before being able to obtain the visa to come to the United States. And so the feeling then at that point is you can pretty much take care of yourself, right? As between you, your private attorney, and employers that employers or universities that might be helping you, you can figure this out in the private sphere. That's kind of the dominant story, although of course somewhat oversimplified. Slightly in contrast to that, the key things that I found from my set of interviews was a distinct sense of lack of social belonging. So again, by broadening the focus from just looking at legal and economic status to thinking about other dimensions of citizenship, there is a pretty extreme sense of social isolation among many of the temporary visitors that I interviewed. I'll give you an example or two of these as I go into the quotes, but let me just lay them out first. A second finding was that these loose ties, these loose social ties within the United States tend to inhibit substantive integration. And in particular, the interviews revealed a lack of economic and civic integration. The economic one, I think, being particularly interesting because, again, that's sort of against the tide of the literature. Usually it was a difference of degree, right? It was more the comment that particularly for those who are in a STEM field, which is a very high concentration for both the student, scholar, and worker population, that one would not be able to advance to a certain level within their career without obtaining the requisite national security clearance. One would not be able to apply for federal grants without being able to have higher levels of citizenship status, things like that. So not so much paying your everyday bills, but certainly limitations at the economic level that I think are not really sufficiently focused on in the existing literature. In terms of politics, very little sense of either interest or engagement with US politics while in the United States, and also relating to politics, a pretty keen recognition of the way that the policy climate today is making things even harder than they might have been. So whether that be at the time that I was interviewing, it was mostly rumored changes to the H-1B program, to lower caps, which have already been maxed out pretty much every year that they're given, to rumors about restrictions on Chinese students coming to the United States. Many of those rumors are now in fact policies, some of which have already been implemented, but this is, the interviews occurred from 2016 to 2018, was earlier in the fall of 2018. And so it's sort of been a changing climate as those interviews have been unfolding. And then last, this is probably the critical tie, that these loose ties impede formal integration and can encourage a transactional mindset about whether one wants to take the last few steps should they ever become eligible to become a US citizen. So I will just give you just a few quotes to give you a flavor for what those interviews look like. I'm seeing that this is probably really tiny. I'm not even sure if you can see it in the front row. But let me highlight just a few. On this idea of loose ties that inhibit integration, one student said to me, this is a student on the CU campus, I just feel like I'm a student here. I'm here to study and to experience a different culture, to gain as much as possible before I go home. I want to contribute to my country and its development. So that was sort of the justification for going home. Secondly, I think this individual was a postdoc, I believe on a J visa. I feel stuck. I came to this country because there are good opportunities, and there isn't anything stopping me from leaving, but it's the fear of not knowing what's going to happen, and that makes it hard to focus on the present. And that I interpreted to mean the kinds of investments one would make in the present, socially, economically, politically, and otherwise. And then last, this was a tech worker, someone in a high-tech company outside the university. This individual was a Canadian who is eligible to naturalize, has gone through the whole process. H-1B, now has a green card, so has left the status, and has been eligible for a long time. At the moment I met him, actually had his N-400 form to naturalize filled out, and was thinking about submitting it after 15 years of eligibility, but ultimately had not decided and probably wasn't going to turn it in. But he just said, I have a lot of opinions. That was a bit of an understatement. I try to influence my citizen family members about their political views, but I lack standing to participate in US politics. So again, an example of sort of holding back in terms of political integration. The second major claim that I'm making is 4 different points. That there's uncertainty about the future can inhibit integration and also promote a transactional mindset. The transactional mindset, I think, is pretty quick and easy to see. For example, in the first 2 quotes, they say pretty much the same thing. One is to say, I'm not sure if I'll become a citizen once I'm eligible. I think a green card should be sufficient because after you have a green card, you don't need anyone to sponsor you to work. So it's this idea of just staying green. So very much wanting that initial stability, but not particularly caring about what happened beyond that. Secondly, a very similar sentiment, citizenship is not an emotional matter for me. My Indian citizenship is a document, it's not an identity. Whether or not I become a citizen will be determined by relative convenience only. And convenience in this case mostly meant travel. And then here are a few that I think start to reflect the changing political climate. An individual who said they've been changing a lot with H-1Bs, tech workers. I was abbreviating so I could fit it on the slide. I don't want to be in the position someday where my job is not dependent on my abilities, but based on the discretion of someone in the government. And then last, this one I think was particularly pointed. Why would I stay in the US if I can gain better social status in my home country because of my education here in the US versus because of bias that results from the belief that the Middle East is linked to terrorism. So just a flavor of the kinds of experiences that are prevented people. I think that I both reduce the desire to remain in the United States and the willingness to make the kinds of investments that lead to further integration. And again, even if the formal pathway were strengthened and provided. Okay. So let me move to the second group, bearing in mind that there is this common story as well as a more distinct one. And this again is the focus on DACA recipients as a subset of the undocumented population. The interview questions were somewhat similar. I won't touch on the existing data too much because it's not the part that I contributed, but what it generally says, those in the room like Aaron know very well, the DACA status has been overwhelmingly successful in enhancing the integration of DACA recipients economically, politically in terms of civic engagement, socially and legally in terms of protections from deportation and providing an ability to work without that itself becoming a legal violation. The story that I find is, again, somewhat modified from that, and I think that largely comes out of changes in the present social and political climate. The questions that I asked, again, are somewhat similar to the ones that I asked of the temporary visa holders. I think probably the most distinct ones to highlight would be how would losing DACA affect you? Which, again, at the time I began asking that question was a little bit more of a speculative possibility. It was before the rescission of DACA had been announced and before all of the litigation had started working its way through the courts. What is your perception of the current political climate for immigrants, and what are your thoughts on the proposed DREAM Acts, which is to say the various pathways to citizenship that Congress has considered? All right, so some of the key findings, and again, these are, you'll see some similarities to what I found with the temporary visa holders. One, that the substantive belonging that's widely reported in the literature about DACA recipients, in my interviews, was proved to be only partial. That it was somewhat contingent on the fact of recognizing, perhaps even more so with the introduction of these tantalizing possibilities, that DACA, while a valuable status, is not full citizenship status. Secondly, that partial belonging, again, inhibits future integration as well as present integration, I should probably add. And then lastly, the sense of legal liminality has spillover effects for other types of engagement in the United States. So again, just a few quotes to give you a sense of what these responses looked like. On the finding that substantive belonging is partial, which again is a slight modification of the major findings in the literature, with or without DACA, my sense of belonging does not depend on papers. So I feel like I just belong. Right? So this is kind of a range of opinions. This is more the dominant story that comes from the literature. Here's one that shows a bit more hesitation. We all say that we're Americans in every sense of the word. We attended the American school system. Our friends are all Americans. I've always pictured my life that I would start a family and retire in America, and I can't do that right now without papers. And then the third, in terms of being asked, after DACA was announced, the rescission was announced, I started asking people about whether they would consider returning to their home country, trying to get at this theme that was more of a palpable reality for many of the DACA recipients, but also one that, again, had come pretty strongly out of the temporary visa holder category, right? The majority of people intending to return to the United States. And the answer was nearly uniform. No, I would not return to my home country. I would not belong there. There's nothing there for me. I don't know anyone there. I have no ties there. And so the sense of being kind of stuck in limbo. In terms of legal liminality, that inhibits integration. The first of these examples, it's really hard for me to think about the future. I try to live in the moment rather than making big plans, because if I don't meet those plans, I'll just be disappointed. Secondly, having a permanent solution would help, because I would know, I would know that my future would be here in this country, and that getting a degree would actually be worth it. Thirdly, and these are the ones where I think you see the policy climate coming into play, just exacerbating a feeling that had always been there before. I used to think that I could be a DACA holder for the rest of my life, but seeing what's happening to TPS, temporary protected status, which has also been, or the government has been trying to hold it back. It was just a week or two ago that effort to withdraw TPS was enjoined in court. But after seeing what happened to TPS, I realized that nobody is secure anymore. And then finally, with all the opportunities, this is a brighter note, with all the opportunities I have under DACA, if DACA ended, I could possibly do contract work in the United States. I could run my own business. There's a lot of DACA recipients who now have professions or knowledge that could help them with jobs, even if they will still need to work around the issue of work permits. So, a range of experiences. So let me start to wrap this up, and then I would really love to hear your thoughts and to hear your questions on the research. In terms of thinking about this link between status, or in this sense, a semi-citizenship status, and the ultimate goal of a fuller integration that would include economic, social, political, and possibly legal belonging, I was trying to get a sense of the pathways that might produce that. Lawyers, but I think also popular audiences are very interested in solutions to the problems that you lay out for them. So this is my effort to try to figure out how to tie the empirics together with the beginnings of policy prescriptions. And so for the temporary visa holder class, this has become a familiar story. Temporary status constrains the substantive integration. The possibility of a pathway for some, in particular the H-1B holders who can extend and then adjust their status, leads to uncertain outcomes. Many may want their green card, yet remain ambivalent about becoming U.S. citizens. And so therefore, this is the beginning of the policy prescription. They need a formal legal pathway and a welcoming climate, and the words aren't on the slide, but on page, affirmative institutional support to try to make the steps between those bridges that do exist. For undocumented immigrants, I think there's almost a reversal in the initial state. DACA recipients generally feel a sense of substantive belonging, although, as I mentioned, a more partial one that might be generally believed. And yet that substantive integration is also constrained and eroded without formal citizenship. therefore needing a legal pathway to maintain the sense of belonging that was initially intact, and to prevent the loss or the erosion of that hard-earned sense of substantive citizenship. And then, of course, consequently, economic and other limitations if DACA is fully rescinded. Okay, so this begins to be a sketch of the policy section. It's not really the focus of the chapter that I wanted to present today, but people usually just want to know. Usually the first question is, so what will you do about this? These are some of the key principles that I think would be important. Recognizing that there is a commonality to this experience, as well as I said, certain particularities. In terms of commonalities, that both categories feel limited, and that indeed, putting it in the context of the larger book, all immigrants feel this way to some degree under the current policy climate. That primarily temporary visitors feel this in terms of social limitations, and that for DACA recipients, they feel it in terms of the economic, political, and particularly the legal limitations. And so let me, I feel like I'm repeating myself a little bit, let me move to some of the more tailored solutions. As key examples, these are the three principles that I developed in the conclusions in the conclusory chapter. One, that preserving or establishing pathways to formal citizenship need to be a threshold to full membership. Again, sort of this assertion that you can't forget about full citizenship, even if formal citizenship, even if that itself won't be enough to get to full citizenship, but it still needs to be some piece of it. And for temporary visitors, this means needing more on-ramps to be able to bridge, if you remember that pathway, to bridge the perforated paths and to make that final jump. So things like, for those statuses that don't presently have it, being able to express a dual intent, a purpose to come to the United States initially for work or for school, but also simultaneously an intent to potentially settle without committing immigration fraud by admitting that dual intent. Secondly, a variety of bureaucratic changes that could ease the transitions to extend visa statuses and then ultimately to adjust to a pathway to permanent and then formal citizenship. For undocumented immigrants, this is more challenging, needing to actually excuse the undocumented status through things like the DACA program, which is a particular form of prosecutorial discretion, which is to say, to create instances where one who is out of lawful status will not be prosecuted by the U.S. federal government, and instead provided opportunities to sort of escape enforcement, to remedy their status through vehicles such as cancellation of removal or a consideration of the equities of someone who has lived their full life in the United States. These traditionally have been principles in immigration law, so they're not completely radical, although they are definitely not the trend of immigration policy today. And then things like the DREAM Act that would provide for some form of legalization. Aside from formal citizenship, enhancing the substantive citizenship pathways, and again, this is developed more in other parts of the book. This goes to some of the softer and decentralized and voluntary supports outside of the federal government. So things like for temporary visitors, creating a reason to stay with higher levels of social integration. For undocumented immigrants and DACA recipients, this idea of sanctuary networks, so recognizing the importance of support at the local and the state level, but also in less conventional sites, universities, private corporations, churches that again don't have an obligation but have taken significant responsibility in stepping up the provision of social support and economic support for those who are out of status. And then finally, setting forth an alternative vision for national immigration policy. And I stress national as opposed to federal because I think it includes federal and other levels of policy. But a policy that values immigrants as equal members of society with all of these different dimensions we've been talking about, rather than focusing only on their legal status, in particular the enforcement of their legal status. So I welcome all manner of feedback, but these are things that I'm particularly interested in hearing about. One, how does this pathway framing work for those who in fact don't have a pathway? So does it make sense, as the Stanford reviewers asked, to include this substantial section about those who have blocked pathways. Sort of subsets of that question: should temporary visa holders and undocumented both be included in this chapter? I started feeling a little bit like they either each deserved their own chapter, or that I could have focused on just the undocumented recipients, DACA recipients. And then also, there is some conceptual slippage, as there always is with empirical work, but the use of these particular populations as proxies for the larger categories, right? So focusing on international student scholars, high-tech workers, which are one slice of temporary worker, but they are not in many ways representative of TPS holders, H-2A agricultural workers, other kinds of temporary workers. There's obviously some really important differences there. And then DACA recipients, again, being a very particular subset of the undocumented population. Secondly, what do you think about the comparisons, both the differences and the similarities? The similarities, again, I didn't really expect to see such a similar story arising from all of the many different legal categories. And then finally, how do these empirical findings sort of set up the policy prescription? So I'll leave this up, but don't let it feel restricting to you, but just as some specific things that I know that I've been struggling with. And then I will just mention to you that if you are interested in more information on the book as I've been working on it, or you'd like to request the particular chapter, I'd be happy to share that. I know that IBS doesn't have a tradition of circulating widely. In this particular place, I was happy about that because the interviews are not fully de-identified yet in the draft that I'm working on. If I fully did that, I wouldn't remember who was who anymore. But I didn't want it to be a very, very public distribution. So I'll leave it on the slide, but I'm open for questions and comments.
Yeah, so maybe this goes to differences, or maybe this goes to how well do the empirical findings map into the policy prescription. But one thing I was thinking about was the idea of control groups. And I don't know what would be a control group for DACA, so that's maybe, a difference. But for the temporary visitors, it seems like you've got also international students and postdocs and faculty who came to Colorado from other states, but who are citizens, right? And they might have some of the same issues about civic integration and not having if someone comes here as a PhD student from New York and they're not thinking they're going to stay in Colorado afterwards, some of the same kinds of issues about whether they're going to invest in getting involved in politics or civic affairs or things like that while they're here. So I was just sort of wondering if you thought it would be useful, not that you want to do any more interviews, I'm sure, but if you thought it would be useful to sort of, since you're focusing on the sort of formalities of citizenship, to have this control group where you ask people who are similarly here for similar reasons temporarily, but who are citizens, whether they have the same kinds of issues, and then see how much citizenship affects
So
them.
those who actually have full citizenship status.
Yeah.
It's a good idea. I mean, I think the way I could pull it out of the existing interviews, and again, I didn't realize this till after I had started writing the chapters in their current outline, is that many of the people who I was studying for chapter 3, the high-tech workers who already had green cards, as you said previously, were in these more temporary statuses. So that would be a way I could look to the existing interviews and to see moments where they reflected on their earlier experiences. So that would be one not too difficult way to bring in that issue.
A couple of questions. Do you think that perhaps the reason international students don't seem to feel so integrated is because they really represent the elites from their sending country? And do you talk a little bit in the book about how expensive it is for an international student to come and go to school here?
So I think I would start with, the way that I think I speak to this most directly is through almost that exact word, thinking about elites. Because I would consider in that category both those who are economically elite. Again, this is a campus environment. Many of you are aware of how high the tuition is for foreign students.
And many times over for, yes, exactly, for the foreign students.
Right. And so that is definitely, I think, an aspect of what makes that group unique.
Yes.
I think that there's another way that eliteness comes through, and for those who have studied the immigration scholarship, I always get pushed on the extent to which I consider race and countries of national origin. And so the other way that I see that eliteness come through is that those who are coming from countries that have relatively high economic advantage as well. So for example, those who are coming from China or India or Canada might feel like the prospect of leaving the United States is not that dire if they have equally good or better jobs waiting for them. Right? And that's a very different experience than if somebody is asked to return to a less stable part of the Middle East. Right? So in both of those trajectories, I wanted to think about aloofness. I didn't really see that feeding, at least in the interviews, I didn't really see it feeding a sense of isolation. I think I saw it more playing into the transactional mindset of feeling like one other's options were not so bad. And so perhaps not feeling either the strength of desire or the heavy cost of not being able to otherwise continue.
Well, the other quick question was, do you talk at all about states like Colorado that actually offer their undocumented driver's licenses to kind of help get them into that semi-legal status?
I think it comes up mostly through the attribution of the DACA status.
Okay.
Because DACA doesn't automatically afford you a driver's license, but it certainly makes you eligible for it, among other benefits like lower in-state
as well as
tuition.
other undocumented who have access to that.
Right, although the driver's license laws, all 50 states allow DACA recipients to obtain driver's licenses. All 50 do not yet allow undocumented immigrants who don't have DACA to have driver's licenses.
Yes, but Colorado does actually.
Although on the ground, from what I understand,
It's very
difficult to get an appointment and
It
follow.
just changed, and it's supposed to, the revised law is supposed to go into effect in January.
Right, so that wouldn't have been captured in my interviews. But what I will say is that because many of the DACA recipients in my sample, but also in the nation, are quite young, what I found to be really interesting is on this idea of the transnational identity and sort of mobility and the travel benefit, I ended up needing to create a new code for driver's licenses. Because for DACA recipients, of course, travel outside the country is quite limited and is not a very good idea. But within the United States, the idea of mobility was so vital to that sense of belonging, both social belonging. There were so many stories of people who became aware of their own undocumented status when they turned 16, wanted a driver's license, and realized they couldn't have one. But also recognizing the importance of being able to drive to get to work, and then therefore be able to economically integrate.
It's very restrictive.
It's definitely figured in a very large way for the DACA recipients. I guess there wasn't much of a control group in that sense, to go to your earlier point, of those who did not have, they're just sort of by accident in our recruiting strategy. We had one student who just didn't have DACA status at all. It was just undocumented. She was statutorily ineligible. It was a little heartbreaking because her sister had it, but she was like 1 year too old. So it wasn't even the dramatic difference of someone who had a criminal conviction or something else and other confounding factors, but it really was a very arbitrary difference, that just shows laws draw lines and sometimes you fall outside of them. But one individual isn't really enough to draw any robust statements about the difference.
Yes, my question is actually twofold, but they're all related. I was wondering if you uncovered any kind of sentiment among temporary visitors toward the so-called illegal immigrants. So what they feel, how they feel about them, whether they feel like they've had to jump through lots of hoops. Because the conventional wisdom is that immigrant communities in the States are pro-amnesty, which is not true. It depends on the community, right? And also, I can see that there are dimensions of insecurity. So for temporary visitors, since they came after their adolescence, they feel worried about never fitting into society culturally. But at the same time, the DACA recipients know all the pop culture. They grew up middle school, or sometimes elementary school, right? So they're totally familiar with all the cultural references, right? So I don't know if you actually presented some kind of juxtaposition between the two, like the economic security and also the cultural security.
Yeah. I wish I had. I wish I had asked more directly, because I think it's a really fascinating question. Although I didn't have a question that directly asked about those intergroup attitudes, it did come up in some of the interviews. I think as you might have keyed in on, in my own comparison, that was one of the things I found so interesting, is that there is, again, in a slightly simplified way, there's almost a complete mirror image, like a flip, right, for the experience of temporary visitors who socially felt the most isolated, economically probably the most, and for DACA, the opposite, right? And then also the legal dimension, I should say, because for temporary visitors, again, though they don't have full citizenship status, are in lawful status, right? And again, in an immigration enforcement climate, that's a critical difference.
Right.
So I saw that, but in terms of asking people directly, I think that I didn't see a lot of commentary in the particular interviews you're asking about with international students and scholars. I think largely because there wasn't strong interest in staying. So I'm not sure if there were necessarily jealousies about whether or not it was fair that an individual could stay if they actually didn't really want to. Where I did see it come up was in the chapter I did not present today, in the discussion of family-sponsored and economically based green card holders, refugees and vets. There I saw it come up a bit more, commentary about, for example, I remember a particular interview with a Chinese immigrant from Burma, I think it was, who happened to get her citizenship by marrying a U.S. citizen, so through a family-sponsored track, but had a lot of opinions about the refugee track, because in her country of national origin, many others would have come through a refugee status. And spoke about her perceptions about immigration fraud, and so therefore the importance of the government sort of policing this process. And so those views did come up, and that was an interesting one to take into account. I'm trying to think if there's more that I could do with that for the study, having not asked about it systematically. I mean, I think it might be important to think about, at the very least, in thinking about policy prescriptions, because certainly there is a tendency in the book, I think, to start with perhaps too strong a normative presumption that everybody thinks integration is a good idea. And you know, if the book is about the current climate, that is clearly not true. And so perhaps engaging that and acknowledging that that comes both across political differences, but also inter-country differences might be important.
I have a question. I don't know, when you interview these F1 students, are all, well, you mentioned some postdocs, and I don't know if you also distribute like PhD students with undergrad students, and how their views or their opinions look differently, because I think it's, the circumstances are very different. Like, for example, for grad students, we don't pay tuition. So I don't know if there are like, I think there are probably other concerns that are that can put them in different position. I don't know. I'm curious about if they are thinking similarly or not, and how that also contrasts with the people at the tech, and how their feelings of belonging are different or not, or their ideas of coming back are different or not.
Right. I originally had a slide, and then I just felt like the numbers were getting too small. I mean, I know that you don't really run degrees of freedom on qualitative interviews, but it's sort of that same principle. So I didn't put it up here, but I do know that as compared with the sort of the older individuals within the groups, you know, sort of more toward the international scholars as opposed to the international students, what I saw as the most striking difference was probably a product of age, you know, just sort of life stage. And there was something convenient about looking at international students as opposed to DACA recipients, because again, even though I didn't seek them out for this reason, they're in a more similar life stage. But I think for international scholars, I mean, this idea of permanence, I think had more traction. Definitely was on people's minds more, and I think partly that might be that the H-1B can convert, whereas the F-1 doesn't necessarily automatically. But I think some of that was as simple as, you know, when you're dating someone in your 30s, the prospect of marrying and settling down is more real than someone who's 18 years old, and is coming for an additional bachelor's degree. There was a quote that I used to have.
What I was thinking.
Yeah, so I think that's what I saw the most clearly, was life stage. There was one quote that was up there. It was a student who was, I think he was a postdoc. And he had said he was all set to stay in the United States, and then he broke up with his girlfriend, and then that just changed everything. And so he realized that his meaningful social ties are in his home country, and there's, we're in a university environment. There's a certain poignancy to that story, but I think it is reflective of a bigger reality, right? That people's concerns are really about settling for
Thank you for your presentation. But I'm curious and still puzzled about how your empirical study about the pathway to citizenship can be applied to integration process of lots of asylum seekers from Middle East in European countries. And I think theoretically the dilemma of integration and exclusion is almost everywhere across the globe. So just some comments.
Yeah, I don't know that I could speak through the empirical lens, because those individuals were not included in the study that I carved out. I think what I can say most specifically is in the chapter that I did not present today that included refugees who are distinct from asylum seekers that I think you're speaking about, insofar as they have an overseas determination that they are entitled to asylum and the full protections that it brings. And then once they're in the United States, had a series of packages and benefits and streamlined, expedited timelines that an asylum seeker would eventually become eligible for, but only after a fairly protracted process within the United States that involves detention and other kinds of things that refugee seekers that refugee holders do not have in the United States. So in terms of the integration, I think that, one way of answering would be to say that once inside the United States, it shouldn't be that different, because once they've been awarded that status, they are in the same legal position going through the framework. In both situations, there's been an experience of trauma that obviously interacts with integration as well. But I think that I'd be hesitant to generalize too much, because I think some of those background experiences are actually quite important and quite importantly different. In terms of that experience existing elsewhere, I think I could make some reflections in the conclusion, but the book just really isn't set up. It's a book about U.S. immigration and integration. Do we have time for one more question?
One quick last one. So I'm curious, what extent do you think the timing or period effects of these interviews affect your findings, or if you, for those that have been here longer than, say, this current administration, how have their views changed across time? Were you able to capture that, or were there future plans? Have they
It's such a
changed
good
because
question.
of, yeah.
And if I take it seriously, I will never finish this book. I think that timing became so important that I've had it many times to sit with myself and think about whether I do want to change the timeline for publishing the book, and just be able to see more unfold. I think at the moment, the way that I've tried to account for it is to go back where I can to some of the individual interviews, or at least the groups, and to administer surveys. I haven't really had time to be able to redo all of the interviews, and for those I met, for example, at an episodic event like a naturalization drive, it'd be very difficult to trace back to the individual. But I went to naturalization drives this fall, for example, with a survey that asked simplified versions of the questions, and then just a direct open-ended question: how is the climate affecting you? So I did that. I actually have a conversation this week about how I can do that with the veteran population, because again, there are a lot of changes there. And with the refugee population, there was a subsequent survey that one of the refugee settlement agencies helped me to administer. So I'm trying to tap back in, but it's hard. But I think the basic story is that the good news, I think, for my book is that the seeds of what were already present before are just more fully developed now. So I don't think it's changed the story. I think it's actually just made the story more salient.
Yeah, legal citizenship matters even more today than it did a year ago, 2 years ago. Thank you very much.